Hi friends, welcome back. So today's video is going to be all about orchid care. I've been sick for the past week, so I haven't done much filming. I have 3 different types of orchids I'm going to be showing you guys today, and I'll get into the specific details about them later, but first I want to go ahead and give you guys some history on orchids and just some background information. So I have my notebook here with all the information on it. So if you see me looking down at this, that's why. So there are approximately 28,000 species of orchids that we know about. That doesn't count the ones that haven't even been discovered yet. But this makes orchids one of the largest flowering species of plants. Most orchids are tropical and grow in tropical environments, but because there's so many different varieties and species of orchids, some of them can grow in very different conditions. There are a few different species that have been known to grow in like grasslands and bogs, more wetlandy type areas. And there are also some that have been known to grow in deserts, which I thought was really cool because the article I was reading said that sometimes they even grow on cactuses, which I just think would be really cool to see. There are also a few species, I think about 4 that we know of, that have been found to grow just north of the Arctic Circle, meaning that based on the different variety of orchid you might have, they can grow in a lot of different types of conditions. So make sure you keep that in mind when buying an orchid. A majority of orchids are epiphytes. That means that they grow on something as opposed to in the soil. What this means for us is that when we're growing our orchids, we want to grow them in a similar condition. So what I highly recommend for most orchids is to use some orchid bark. I would say use a mixture of orchid bark, perlite, activated charcoal, and maybe even some type of compost like worm castings or something like that. Orchids do take most of their nutrients in from the air, meaning that you want to fertilize with some type of orchid mist. But it also never hurts to add a little bit of compost into the soil because the roots still can take up that nutrients. I've also seen people grow orchids on like wooden planks, which I think is a really interesting way of displaying them. I'll insert a picture of what I'm talking about. I've never done this myself, but I would like to someday. Some people also grow them in kokedamas, which I made a video of growing one of mine in a kokedama, and that works really well. And if you don't want to do any of those, you can also just grow them in an orchid pot, which are sold at most big box stores. A lot of orchids already come in orchid pots, which is really nice. And if you don't have one of those, then you can just grow it in regular terracotta. As far as lighting goes, orchids are a lot like most other tropical plants. They want that bright indirect light, meaning that you might not want to have it directly under a super bright grow light, but you also don't want to have it in a dark corner. I keep most of mine under just natural window light, and they all do really well there. I do have one that is in my terrarium that I keep under a grow light, but if that one wasn't in a terrarium, I would probably just keep it in a windowsill, and I'm sure it would do fine there. I think a lot of people make the mistake of assuming that because orchids are tropical plants that they need a ton of water, and that's actually not the case. They have very, as I said earlier, thick roots, and the leaves are also very succulent, which helps them hold on to a lot of water. So I recommend that you don't water your orchid until the soil is completely dry or the moss or whatever you're growing it in. You can even tell with the roots if you have a clear pot or you can see the roots that if they're this light green color, that they don't need any water, but if they're more of a darker gray or white color, that they might need some water. I do tend to be an underwaterer, which I find my orchids don't mind at all. So if you are an underwaterer, then you'll be perfectly fine. And if you're an overwaterer, then just make sure you really keep that in mind, that orchids do like to dry out a bit when you are considering watering them. If you notice that the leaves on your orchid are a little bit wrinkly, that can also be an indication that it needs a little bit of water. So this is the typical Phalaenopsis orchid that you think of when you think of orchids. It's currently in bloom, and it has been for a while now, which I find really surprising because I assumed that the bloom would die off when we moved just because it was going to be adjusting to the new conditions, but it's still going perfectly strong. It's a fairly large orchid, and I'm going to take it out of its cover pot to show you guys. Right now it's pretty dry, and I have it growing in just a regular potting mix because I didn't have any orchid bark when I got it. And it didn't come in orchid bark. It came in this really like peaty mix that I didn't think it would like at all. So I wanted to repot it really quick. And so I do eventually want to repot it into some better soil, but I figured if it's blooming and it's happy, then I would just leave it be. But eventually I will be repotting it. Um, I'll show you a little bit of the roots. You can kind of see what I was saying earlier about the roots being like a white color. This is how I know that it needs watered. Once I water it and the roots have soaked up some water, they'll turn more of a green color. I have not repotted this orchid since I got it. This is the same pot that it came in. All I did was change out the soil. And I've had it for a while now, about a year and a half, and it's still just doing pretty fine. So I would say when it comes to repotting orchids, definitely don't worry if they're a little root bound. I think they enjoy it, so don't worry about that. It's going to be really difficult for your orchid to flower if it's not getting enough light or water. So I would keep it, especially if you really want it to flower, I'd keep it in a nice sunny window and make sure that you're not letting it dry out for too long. Definitely go on the side of underwatering, as I mentioned earlier, but if you leave it too dry for a very long time, then it's going to have a hard time pushing out flowers, or the flowers that it already has are going to die off. I'd say with this one, I water it maybe once a week, and it is currently in bloom, so it needs a little more water than it would if it wasn't in bloom, so keep that in mind. Now, when your orchid is done flowering, a lot of people are confused on whether or not you should cut the stem off or if you should leave it there. I just cut it down right here, and then it ended up pushing out this new vine or whatever it's called right here. So if you do like break off or cut off um, the bloom, so if you do end up accidentally breaking off or you cut off the vine, then that's okay. It will grow another one, but you can also just cut off the flowering part right at the node. So I'll show you. This one actually has a second bloom coming out of it. But when this is done blooming, I would just cut it off right here, and then it'll push out this other bloom. And I've never seen an orchid push out two blooms at the same time, so I assume that this one won't start blooming until this one dies off. There also looks like there's another node right here that I could cut it off at, but again, you could also just cut it down at the base of the plant if you want. Also, you want to cut off the stem completely if it starts to turn brown or yellow, because that just means that the vine itself is dying off anyway. So you can just cut it off and it'll grow another one at a different time. As far as humidity goes, they really don't need a ton of humidity. If you have it, they probably appreciate the extra boost of humidity, but it's not something that I particularly worry about with mine. I don't keep them next to a humidifier or anything, and they still grow fine. The last tip I want to point out is that they are toxic to pets. So if you have a dog or a cat that is interested in chewing on your plants like I do, make sure you keep them out of their reach because they can be toxic. So you guys have already seen the classic Phalaenopsis orchid that I have, but I have a couple more that I want to show you just to show you the different varieties of them. So this one I have right here is just the mini Phalaenopsis orchid. It's the exact same as the regular one, it just stays much smaller. It has much more narrow leaves, I've noticed, and they don't get much bigger than this from what I've heard. I think this is the biggest one it has. And then it has another leaf that is trying to come out right now, but I've been underwatering it a bit too much, so it's drying out a little bit. But all in all, this is the exact same care as the other orchid. I just have it growing in a kokedama in this cute little mug, which I really like how it looks. Just one example of an interesting way you can display your orchids. You can also get variegated Phalaenopsis orchids, which I think would be really cool to have. I don't have any of those, but I assume the care is pretty similar, but you may want to give it a bit brighter light just because of the variegation. And the last orchid I want to show you guys is actually in my terrarium. So this right here is my jewel orchid. The care for it is pretty simple as well. I keep it in a terrarium, which I've noticed a lot of people do with jewel orchids just because they stay pretty small. I would definitely classify a jewel orchid as a good terrarium plant, but you can also just grow it in regular room humidity, in regular room conditions. I see people do that all the time, but I just really like how it looks in this terrarium. If you want to see how I made this with my husband Wade, you can go and watch my last video. Jewel orchids are a little bit different from Phalaenopsis orchids in the way that they grow. So the Phalaenopsis orchids, as you saw, grow kind of, they push leaves out to the side kind of, but the jewel orchid grows upwards, meaning that it likes to climb. So I've seen a lot of people grow them on moss pools or planks. I'm not sure if you could grow them as like a trailing plant. I've never seen that done, but I think that would look really cool to have like a whole hanging basket of a jewel orchid. So those are just the types of orchids that I have. Obviously, there are a ton of different varieties of them with different leaf shapes and different flower colors and sizes and patterns. So orchids are a really cool and unique plant, in my opinion, that are pretty beginner friendly. So if you're interested in trying one out, I definitely would recommend it. If you enjoyed this video, please press the like button or share it with a friend of yours so they can learn a little bit too. I really appreciate you guys watching, and I'll see you in the next video. Bye!